ADHD is a disabling condition when the environment is not supportive and when the person doesn't understand and doesn't know how to manage the condition. There is a variety of different risks associated with undiagnosed and unmanaged ADHD, from higher risk of substance abuse, higher risk of accidents, depression, anxiety, highest risk of suicide. May I ask a question for you, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Do you think you have ADHD?
I mean, there's so much to unpack. Hi, Aggie. Welcome to the show today. I'd like to start just by asking you, what is ADHD and how does it affect people?
Sure. Super excited to be here, by the way. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition that affects individuals from the very beginning of their life throughout all the way to their adulthood. And it can manifest in different ways in people. There are differences between men, women, individuals, depending on their environment and circumstances. But some of the commonly quoted symptoms of ADHD are difficulty in focusing and regulating of a variety of different skills and executive functioning. So from attention to focus, through energy to emotions. So generally speaking, it's a challenging way of regulating executive functioning skills.
Yes, and you mentioned there that, people have it from birth throughout life, but certainly more recently we're hearing of lots of people sort of, late diagnosis or discovering that they have ADHD. Mm-hmm. Is that they've always had it, but it's just they've covered it up or not realised, or maybe society hasn't realised. Is that what you're finding?
Well, so there's, ADHD, like a lot of different mental conditions, is nuanced. So there isn't one answer to kind of respond to this question. We're now finding out as researchers that actually there is such a thing as late-onset ADHD, which means that somebody who didn't have ADHD symptoms might suddenly present later in life. There's a chance they always had it to a certain extent, but life circumstances or some big change in life made it so these symptoms became more prominent. However, the consensus is that the majority of people with ADHD always had symptoms. They just weren't caught earlier in life. And that might be due to different things. For example, the diagnostic criteria have been developed in the past, so to say, based on research on boys mostly. So what we understand about ADHD, you will hear people say replicates the hyperactive little boy bouncing off the walls. Now we know that ADHD is much more complex. So quite likely a lot of people who didn't meet these criteria just went on with their life and found later in life when something happened, some major life change, that they might actually have ADHD.
Yeah, and I've heard of masking as well. And is that sort of, certainly in those school years, you get rewarded and punished for certain things, and children learn very quickly how they get praise, how they, fit in, how they don't stand out. And sometimes the lack of focus that ADHD might sort of contradict with that. So do people learn to sort of cover it up?
Yes, and I wouldn't have a problem with it if that covering up and masking would be as a result of praise, but more often than not, it's because of the criticism and corrective messages that people get. So the estimation is that people with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages throughout school than a neurotypical individual. So if you're constantly corrected for how you are, of course, you're going to learn that there's a preferred way of being, and you're going to do your best to essentially fit that mold, so to say, even if it's at the cost, even if it feels like you're constantly fighting an uphill battle. So 100% people learn how to mask, and unfortunately, they mostly learn because of negative reinforcement rather than positive reinforcement.
And I guess that masking is just an additional strain on actually an already very busy brain. So actually it can almost make things worse.
100%. And most often than not, we don't really see the results out there openly. It's something that the person is suffering secretly with. They might take it out on, their nearest and dearest when they are at home and when they feel secure. This might often result in them abusing substances as a way of coping. So it is essentially quite a silent way of suffering. And more often than not, it leads to a feeling of living an inauthentic life. You're living as someone who you are not. And essentially at some point, it can become really troublesome. And hence we see now later in life, people kind of popping up and saying that they have enough, that they actually do want to discover who they are and maybe live a more authentic life as individuals who have an ADHD brain.
Yeah, I had someone on the podcast, a few weeks ago who was, they're late diagnosed with ADHD and autism, and they said it was actually sort of almost life changing because they could begin to accept who they were. And we are having a lot more of late diagnosis. Would you say this? I guess we hear those comments, don't we, in the media? Oh, everyone has ADHD these days, and it's a trend. But is it just that actually people are starting to discover what they have maybe covered up for many years as a child?
I'll share my personal opinion. We'll see in a few years' time, and maybe we'll find out actually that the diagnostic criteria and the process were completely void, and all of those people who received their diagnosis shouldn't have. But I personally believe that we're just starting to scratch the surface of those people who kind of slipped through the cracks. One thing that I'm making a bet on, we'll see in 10 years' time, I think that we're going to arrive at the conclusion that neurodiversity in general is much more complex as a multidimensional spectrum, as opposed to somebody neatly only fitting the ADHD diagnosis or autism diagnosis or dyslexia or dyspraxia. More likely, I think, we're all kind of, operating in this, or we're emerging in this multidimensional space, so to say. So we might find out that actually the diagnostic criteria we're using at the moment are not really accurate as we kind of progress with science. So to answer your original question with ADHD, I have ADHD myself. Long story, always longer. Yep. Going back to what you asked about, I actually think that there are many more people who haven't been diagnosed, and we're only going to be discovering more and more of them.
Yeah. I mean, you said you've got ADHD. When did you discover that?
Mm-hmm. So just for the context, I'm a psychologist and a coach. So I've worked in a psychology and coaching space for a decade, longer than a decade, really. So if you think that there's a person who should have known they had ADHD, it was me. I learned about ADHD at uni. I thought about ADHDers as a mostly boys' condition. So to say, that was what I was taught. The same with autism. And back in 2019, I had quite a cutthroat career, so to say, really busy, working with high-profile clients, always on the go. And suddenly, out of the blue, I started getting panic attacks at work. So as a typical psychologist, I diagnosed myself. I thought that I had generalized anxiety. For me, it was formality. I would go to a psychiatrist, tell them that I had anxiety. They would give me something to help it stop, because I tried a lot of holistic approaches. I'm a really holistically minded person. So I would always try everything before I go into the medical route, so to say. Yeah. Nothing helped. So I thought it would be a very simple process. I would tell the psychiatrist what was wrong with me, and they would just let me go. Turns out we had the first assessment, and the psychiatrist said, wait a second, we need to kind of dig a little bit deeper. And after a long process involving my partner, my family, multiple consultations, he actually said that I had ADHD combined type, so both inattentive and hyperactive, to a very strong degree. So that was a real shock to me. I thought that, as I mentioned, if there was one person that should have known, it probably should have been me. So I started questioning my professional skill set, only to realize that really, we just started back then recognizing that ADHD can affect women, and it can affect women very differently to men. So yeah, that's how I found out I had ADHD.
Yeah, you mentioned that it can affect men and women differently, because we do traditionally maybe look at those, young boys bouncing off the walls, can't sit still, and that's where we think ADHD sits. But actually, it's on a spectrum as such. And you mentioned there's lots of different variants, and you might have one bit but not another. But equally, you could have one but not have ADHD, and so on. So it's clearly a lot more complex than perhaps it's been sort of given credit for in recent years.
100%. And we have to remember that, the person isn't just their ADHD. ADHD really describes the way they process the world, the way they think, maybe the way they, interact and absorb what's happening around them. But on top of that, there are many other things that affect a person, from personality to early childhood experiences and coping strategies that we develop throughout life. So, there isn't one type of ADHD. Every person is different. And there's this beautiful statement in the autism movement, which I think autism movement is a little bit ahead of the ADHD movement, if we call it as such, where they say when you meet one person with autism, you met one person with autism. And I feel when we talk about ADHD, this understanding is somehow lost. And we just have this image of somebody who's hyperactive, cannot sit still, bounces off the wall, etc. And therefore, anyone who doesn't match that standard, isn't considered as a possible ADHDer, so to say. So I think, yes, it's a very varied condition, and it's just one part of who a person is.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. You say, that is just one part of, who a person is, because actually that, there can almost be some benefits in the way that ADHD people think. And we particularly seem to see a high percentage of entrepreneurs end up late finding out that they've got ADHD. Do you think there's a link there between whether it's the, determination, whether it's the risk taking? Do you think there's a link?
I think there is a link. What kind of a link? I'm not sure if the research has been done about that, but it could be a variety of different things, like it often is with humans. So, one thing is that I personally believe that ADHD can lead to certain unique strengths. I would never say that ADHD is superpower. There are those kind of statements floating online. In the neurotypical world, ADHD is a really tough condition to manage, especially if it's undiagnosed, if it's misunderstood and mismanaged. So not to trivialize ADHD, it's a serious condition that needs to be addressed. But I believe that when it's addressed and understood properly, it can really help the person tap into their unique strengths. And those tend to be creativity, innovation, thinking outside of the box. For hyperactive individuals, that could be, boundless energy and enthusiasm and charisma, etc. So partly, I think these strengths can lead someone to embark on an entrepreneurial path. Partly, I also think that generally speaking, the clients that I work with, and including myself, we don't really fit the mold. If we're really, really honest, the 9-to-5 lifestyle really doesn't fit us because of our, surges of energy and attention, etc. We can hyperfixate on something intently for a really short period of time, but get 8 times as much done as a neurotypical person, for example. That obviously doesn't fit the standard, you log in at 9, you log off at 5 system that we kind of created. So I think that partly it's also that because we don't really fit the mold, we need to kind of carve out a path for ourselves. And that often means having your own business or doing kind of a patchwork career, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, something that is more novel and varied, so to say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I saw an interview with Mr. Beast, a world famous sort of YouTuber, and he was asked about, do you have ADHD or have you considered? And he sort of was like, well, actually, yeah, I have been told I have, but I'm quite happy with my brain because it's allowed me to be so focused on the only thing I was doing was growing YouTube, and I worked on it every day. And actually he was like, yes, but I don't lean on that because actually he really liked his brain. But actually for some people really struggle with ADHD. And I'm guessing that's, maybe like you mentioning there, doesn't fit into the 9-to-5 sort of thing. So people maybe at school as well actually don't fit into that mold, that normal society values of how you're meant to perform, how you're meant to behave and all of that. And is that where people struggle with it?
I think, as you said previously, ADHD also functions on a spectrum. So the severity of ADHD will kind of show up differently for people. One important aspect of ADHD as well is I'm currently doing my PhD. I'm in the second year of a PhD in child and adolescent psychiatry. And I'm specifically focusing on the experience of trauma among adolescents with ADHD and autism. So one thing that often gets missed is that people with ADHD and autism, and I assume other neurodiversities, are much more likely to encounter adverse events in life or traumatic events. And the way they process these events is much more likely to lead into PTSD or comorbid conditions. So the conditions that can co-occur with ADHD, such as depression and anxiety. So if you think about that, that might also be the reason why people with ADHD might be struggling. Some of them might be struggling more than others. Those who did encounter adverse events, traumatic events, etc., that's a very different life trajectory to somebody who had a supportive environment, who has been told from the very early age that they are talented and gifted, whose parents maybe directed them in the right way. I've got a friend who is an Olympic athlete, and the way his parents dealt with his hyperactive ADHD was essentially by sending him to every sports class that there was available. They obviously didn't know he had ADHD,
No.
but they just figured out a way to, keep him busy and his kind of hyperactivity, so to say. And now he's a renowned athlete, so to say. So circumstances matter in how people experience ADHD, and also the severity in itself differs from person to person.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about, they found a way to actually, use some of that energy. Do you think that, people with ADHD, it's about finding some of those holistic coping ways, of whether it's structuring your day, whether it's, doing certain activities and things like that, just to help you process, data and get through the day rather than someone who's neurotypical?
I 100% believe that. So, for the background information, I run my own business called Holistic ADHD Co., which essentially provides coaching services to people with ADHD or those who suspect they might have ADHD. Kind of harnessing exactly what you described, that holistic, personalized, unique way to truly find a way to function that works with our brains and not against them. And I do think that the system that we created, I don't think it particularly serves neurotypical people either, to be honest. When we look at happiness and satisfaction levels, we've got a lot of work to do, whether you're neurotypical or neurodiverse. But I think specifically for a neurodiverse brain, it's not necessarily that these tools and strategies have been devised for us. So I think when I meet my late diagnosed clients, a lot of them have tried really, really hard. They are high performing, ambitious. They try to do their best, but the tools that they have been given or they have been introduced to are just not working for their brains. So we essentially, in order to be successful, in order to be more balanced, we need to find a way that works with our brain and doesn't stop it at every turn.
Yeah, because there are lots of tools out there, whether it's some productivity tool or something along those lines that actually ends up far too complex. And therefore, actually, it doesn't improve the productivity of someone who's neurodiverse. It actually makes it worse. And then you end up feeling frustrated that, it isn't working. And I guess that frustration is very easy to lead into that failure. Why can't I do this? And actually, maybe that's where people with a late diagnosis actually start to, I suppose, be kinder to themselves and then start to understand, actually, I'm not a failure. I just need to do things differently.
100%. I think, controversially speaking, you will speak to different coaches and different mentors out there and they will tell you different things. But from my experience, the number one thing that a person with ADHD needs to do in order to be able to live more at ease and more in line with their brain is self-compassion. Actually being self-compassionate, that the fact that they have struggled over the years, it doesn't mean that they are a failure. It means that their brain works in a different way and they just deserve and need different kind of support. And what I'm finding is that a lot of people use shame, guilt, anxiety to motivate themselves to continue doing, performing, etc. And of course, this will work up to a point. Like with learned helplessness, it will work up to a point until it doesn't. So we actually need to completely change that inner narrative from bashing ourselves and guilt tripping ourselves to perform to something that is kinder, more self-compassionate, and more sustainable as a result.
Yeah, that really sort of hits home because, certainly for myself, I've often beaten myself up that I haven't been able to do a task like someone else has done it. And I sort of, can't, but equally, I can highly perform. You said that focus of, I'm well known for, I can do, 2 days work in a few hours, but then struggle to do something the following day. And I guess, it's understanding that and being kind with yourself. And actually that's maybe where the 9 to 5 doesn't fit in, but there's so many people stuck in a 9 to 5. So how can they start to be kinder to themselves? What things can people do to help support their sort of, neurodiverse brain?
And you're right. Not everyone is meant to be an entrepreneur. A lot of people actually appreciate the kind of 9 to 5 corporate life, and there are a lot of benefits for being able to kind of sustain that lifestyle, from the fact that you've got more security, more safety, more predictability, more routine. Routine is actually really good for an ADHD brain, even though secretly we don't like it. It's kind of like a paradox. We love it and hate it at the same time. And I could win an international prize for the amount of planners and organization tools that I have and don't use. So obviously there's something in me that loves routine, but it is difficult to maintain on my own. So, a company life can really almost create that routine for us, not to mention community. An entrepreneurial life can sometimes be lonely, and just being part of something bigger can be really, really beneficial for somebody's well-being. So not everyone is supposed to be an entrepreneur, and a lot of us ADHDers are going to try to navigate the corporate life 9 to 5 and so on and so forth. So I think the good starting point is from acceptance, actually accepting that our brain works in a different way, stopping to compare our performance with the performance of others, understanding that in order to find success, whatever that means for each individual, it will require a unique approach, and it will require almost a playful experimental approach whereby different tools, different techniques will be tried and tested. And just because one tool or technique doesn't work doesn't mean that we're a failure. It means that we just haven't found what works. And the key skill, I think, is learning how to navigate your energy throughout the week. So what I'm often seeing is that people start strong on Monday and they have all of this energy, they are focused and enthusiastic, etc. And because they don't really manage their energy, their focus, their executive function in a mindful way throughout the week, they come to the weekend and they crash. And then the weekend is essentially spent on recovery or masking, replenishing the dopamine, so to say.
Yeah.
So I think learning how to kind of recognize where we are in terms of stimulation and understimulation, or overstimulation and understimulation, and knowing how to navigate those two extremes is quite key in being able to sustain this kind of weekly routine where we start on Monday, finish on Friday.
Yeah, you mentioned there about that sort of, the dopamine hit and searching that out. And there certainly is something within people with ADHD needing that, but it's finding it from healthy ways, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I think, it is one of the theories of ADHD. I'll always speak of theories because we're constantly finding new ways of understanding ADHD. One of the theories is around dopamine and norepinephrine. So the two neurotransmitters in the brain that are related to focus, attention, motivation, drive, and so on and so forth. That these two neurotransmitters being lower in the brains of people with ADHD. So essentially, if you constantly lack dopamine or norepinephrine, we're going to try to find whatever source that is available for these two neurotransmitters. And unfortunately, the world has been designed, especially now, to provide really easy sources of dopamine. You don't need to put any work to get a hit of dopamine through social media or through TV or through drinking alcohol or doing similar things like that. So the key thing about dopamine is such that, normally speaking, dopamine is something that we experience or something that increases in our body when we have achieved something. So for instance, when you go to the gym, you're likely to experience a dopamine hit after you have completed your workout. Yeah. Or, back in prehistoric times, you would chase a mammoth, you catch a mammoth, and you would experience the surge of dopamine. Traditionally, dopamine wouldn't be available easily. You would have to put in some effort to achieve it. Now we designed a world where dopamine is almost treated as a tool to capture our attention, to make us addicted and hooked to social media, to devices, to technology, and so on and so forth. So without knowing this, we can very easily sway towards unhealthy sources of dopamine. And I think the trick is also to ask ourselves the question, what kind of person we really want to be? Our highest self, what is that? And trying to kind of align our activities with that, as opposed to being almost, prisoners to our brain craving dopamine.
Yeah, there's certainly some natural things I certainly do to, get my dopamine hit, go to the gym, my ice bath, do all of this. But it was quite interesting, and I like to be productive, and actually I do get a little bit of a buzz from ticking off a job and things like that. So over the years, I've again tried every single productivity tool out there, every single planner, because there seems to be one part of my brain that wants to be really organized. I want it all mapped out. I want it all sat there, know exactly what I'm doing. And then there's almost this other part going, yeah, we won't be doing that. We're going off on a tangent, and that they seem to sort of fight each other.
Yes, 100%. Side quests. There's nothing more juicy and delicious to an ADHD brain than a random side quest. And I guess, part of trying to be productive and achieve things in life is being aware when our mind steers away, and how to gently bring it back on track. So however way you can find to check in with yourself what the priority is at the moment might be a good steer to bring yourself back in. But at the same time, controversially speaking, I think that we sometimes do deserve and need to allow ourselves to go on a side quest. And God knows what we're going to discover at the end of that journey. So it's not, holistic also means balanced in my approach. So it's not all or nothing approach. Our brains, actually, ADHDers often tend to have an all or nothing way of thinking, that I'm either going to be 100% productive or not at all. Trying to find the middle way is probably the right advice when it comes to finding that flow with ADHD, so to say.
Yeah. What are some of the good and healthy things that certainly people with ADHD can use to get that dopamine? You mentioned the gym. I mentioned the ice bath as well. What are some natural ways that are more healthy than doom scrolling, drinking alcohol, and those sort of hits?
So ice bath, by the way, is a fantastic way to get a dopamine hit first thing in the morning, especially for a shorter period of time. 20, 30 seconds of that, and you're bound to start the day with a kind of rush of dopamine, which is great. I think the way we start our morning is really important. So a lot of us wake up and go straight to our phones to check emails or notifications, etc. And then this is almost like a trap. Once you have your phone, then half an hour later, you've kind of wake up and you're still scrolling. So, trying to maybe do something that on a physiological level, we know can increase dopamine levels. So stepping out of the house for about 15 to 20 minutes to get some light exposure. And this can also work on an overcast day. So it doesn't have to be a sunny day. I had people debate with me that, in the UK, we very barely had sun. It doesn't matter. Like the sun, is still going to kind of, infiltrate the clouds and do its job, so to say. Yeah. Trying to avoid coffee first thing in the morning. So that's a habit that I had for very many years. Wake up an espresso and, started the day. Dopamine doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are other neurotransmitters in our bodies, and they tend to counteract or magnify each other. So one thing that coffee in the morning does is it increases cortisol levels in an unnatural way. So it spikes cortisol before your body can actually naturally release cortisol. And too much cortisol can actually counteract dopamine. So surprisingly, having that kind of, sharp awakening in the morning can lead to slower release of dopamine. Trying to do something that is productive or an achievement first thing in the morning. So this doesn't have to be strenuous exercise. This can be a walk. Generally speaking, some sort of a movement first thing in the morning can be quite nice. And then there's a really long list of natural supplements that can help with release of dopamine and norepinephrine as well. My favorite one, without boring your audience about 1,200 different supplements that I've got on my list, one that is less known is called Brahmi. It's a herb used in Ayurveda to harness focus and attention. You can actually buy a powder, probably the cheapest and the easiest way. Warning, it's not really nice in flavor. So it's an acquired taste, let's just say. So you can start from half a teaspoon stirred in lukewarm water first thing in the morning, increasing the dose to about teaspoon after 2 weeks, and it can really engage the brain first thing in the morning. The effect for me was quite similar to stimulant medication for ADHD, so quite a powerful one out there to start the day with.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that. I certainly know that I delay my morning coffee now. I was the same. It was almost the first thing I did in the morning was to put the kettle on, but now I will ice bath and I'll have breakfast, and actually it's, I'm a few hours into my day before I try and have a coffee, because I allow my body to sort of naturally wake up. But this is something I'm discovering aged 45. It's sort of, you think of all those years when actually it was the first thing I got down my neck in the morning. And I guess it's that not understanding yourself.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And there's never too late to start. So we always learn. I think that as people, as psychologists, we always learn new things. So if there's something that you can introduce in your routine at any point in your life that will improve your mood and functioning by 1%, it's 100% worthwhile.
Yeah. Do you think that social media has played a positive impact, however, in highlighting some of the ADHD traits that's then allowed people to sort of go, oh, actually, because certainly, I've seen stuff and go, okay, yeah, that makes sense now.
Mm-hmm. Yes and no. So I'm going to be disappointing here and never providing a clear
No,
answer to your
that's fine.
questions.
But it
I
isn't
think
black and white, is it?
no.
It's never clear.
It's nuanced. So I think definitely really positive in highlighting that ADHD, autism, and so on can exist in varied populations. I think you might be aware that currently the wait list for diagnosis is endless. It's years, not months. So it really can help with self-diagnosis process. And I think self-diagnosis is really valid as well. It can really create a sense of understanding of oneself and motivate someone to try some of these holistic methods before they get officially diagnosed. So in that way, I think it's tremendously positive. I think it's also positive in the way that I personally don't know a single ADHD person in my real life. Now I have quite a community through coach training, through being part of different forums, etc. I've got friends who are ADHDers online, but in my most immediate group of friends, I don't have a single neurodiverse friend, essentially. So social media can create that sense of belonging and community that is really, really important to us humans generally. We're social animals, and we need people who are like us around us. So that's really positive. I think what is less positive is that it can lead to this misconception that things that aren't ADHD are ADHD. And I think there's a lot of creators out there who talk about their experience, which is 100% valid. Everyone's experience is really, really valid. And I think it's important, that people find individuals that they can relate with. But not everything that people speak about is ADHD. It might just be a unique presentation of ADHD or somebody's unique story, so to say. So there was a study, a very small scale, probably not something that is replicable at the moment, but it looked at TikTok videos and the criteria for ADHD traits that they presented, how that aligned with diagnostic criteria that are officially accepted. And the correspondence was really low. So what people presented to be ADHD really through the lens of the diagnostic criteria that we currently have wasn't. Now, the question is, could we improve on the diagnosis process and criteria that we currently have? 100%. So maybe that's where that discrepancy exists.
Yeah.
But still, I'm seeing sometimes, creators talking about some aspect of their life, presenting this as them being ADHD. And it really, it's probably their unique experience more than anything else.
Yeah, because that's the thing. It's understanding, the reason you like doing something or your brain processes certain information. Is that just the way your brain processes it, or is it because of this neurodiverse brain that you've got? And I guess sometimes there's a misunderstanding, and equally there'd be some things of someone who's neurotypical who actually does a few things that the same or likes certain topics, and that's fine. Then they haven't got ADHD, but they just happen to tick one of those boxes.
Yeah, and I think this is where the voices such as, everyone forgets things once in a while, or everyone gets upset and feels criticized once in a while come from. And the reality is that in order to, for these different symptoms to count as ADHD, they all kind of have to exist in a cluster. So it's not just about forgetting something once in a while. It's about forgetting and fidgeting and interrupting, all of these different things all together to an extent that can have a detrimental effect on a person. So very few people seek diagnosis. Maybe now these days people do just for self-knowledge, but most people seek diagnosis because there is some barrier that they are trying to overcome. In my case, this was obviously quite an extreme barrier. I literally started having panic attacks at work and I needed help immediately. But there's usually some difficulty that somebody is dealing with. So they seek answers in order to find solutions to overcome these barriers. So it might be that, as you mentioned, your friend who was it a friend I think you mentioned who might have ADHD, or the YouTuber?
Yes.
That was the YouTuber who got told they might have ADHD, but actually it hasn't really impacted them in a significant or detrimental way enough to actually seek the diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah. Yes. I guess that's it, isn't it? Understanding, actually, is this holding me back? Is it causing me problems in my daily life? Is it affecting how I interact with people, how I perform at work, or just how you feel in yourself? Because you mentioned almost right at the start about that sort of self-compassion and just being kinder to yourself.
Yes. Yeah, 100%.
I mean, there's so much to unpack, and it was interesting. You were saying that we're learning so much as we go on, and you think actually there's going to be some changes in the way we sort of diagnose and look at things. Do you think this is still we're very early in understanding neurodiverse people?
I wouldn't say we're very early. I think, when I compare what I learned at university more than 10 years ago and where we are right now, we've made massive developments and we understand what's happening much, much better. The technology has also caught up. So now we have brain imaging technology, different ways of assessing people that weren't available before. So I don't think that we're at the very beginning of the understanding of neurodiversity, but there's definitely more questions that we're unraveling as we go along and more things to clarify. And in reality, humans are really complex. It's difficult to find, one-to-one match between the question and the answer. More likely, at the moment, ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions are behavioral conditions. So we diagnose them based on the behaviors that we observe. But if you think about it, one of the debates out there is, can trauma cause ADHD? And the consensus so far is that trauma cannot cause ADHD, but it can cause similar behavioral symptoms. And that's why a really good diagnostician needs to be present to be able to untangle, is this something that is likely to be a neurodevelopmental condition that was present, before something traumatic happened? Or can this person have these behavioral symptoms that look like ADHD, but actually aren't? So, I don't remember where I started with this.
No, I did. But it is, an incredibly complex situation.
Yes, humans are complex.
Yeah. And you mentioned that actually the sort of waiting list for diagnosis is years now. I mean, do you think something will need to change on that at some point?
I would hope that something would change. I'm not sure if it will, sadly. There are some voices about potentially capping right to choose for ADHD and I think autism diagnosis as well. Essentially, what this means is that previously and now still patients had the right to choose a private clinic that had lower waiting list for diagnosis. And if the clinic was participating in this scheme, they could offer diagnosis and these diagnoses could be paid for by NHS. So actually that would be great help for people who cannot afford private diagnosis. There are voices about potentially capping the right to choose capacity, which would be, in my opinion, extremely detrimental. Going back to a slightly grimmer account of ADHD is a disabling condition when the environment is not supportive and when the person doesn't understand and doesn't know how to manage the condition. There is a variety of different risks associated with undiagnosed and unmanaged ADHD, from higher risk of substance abuse, higher risk of accidents, depression, anxiety, highest risk of suicide. There is an estimation that people with ADHD live shorter lives because of different, maybe different way how they go about their life, so to say. Yeah. So it's not a joke. It's not something that can be left misunderstood and untreated for 3, 7, 10 years when somebody is experiencing detrimental effect of ADHD. So I certainly hope that something is going to change. My heart especially breaks for children and for young people. As part of my PhD, I interviewed parents of children who are struggling with ADHD and autism in mainstream education. And the accounts are heartbreaking. So my heart specifically breaks for these young people who don't have developed coping mechanisms and executive function skills just yet to navigate this complex condition. So I really, really hope that something is going to change and it will be taken as seriously as it should be.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that one. What's you mentioned about children, and it's such a critical time because actually their brains are still developing as well at that period, and actually they're potentially stuck in a school situation that isn't maybe supporting them, and that can, and maybe we're going to see it, or maybe we're seeing it with adults now in late diagnosis, actually manifests and actually come out at a much later time in life.
Yeah, 100%. I think, there's a great potential in finding out about ADHD earlier in life and learning how to manage it. When we're younger, our brains are much more neuroplastic, so changes are much more easy, or much more easily introduced than when we're a little bit older. So to me, it's a missed opportunity not to diagnose and not to help these young people earlier in life. Anecdotally, most of my clients have experienced some sort of a traumatic event at school because they didn't know they had neurodiversity, whether that's bullying, whether that's constant failure in schoolwork, etc. And those events, especially when processed by somebody who has a hyperactive nervous system, can be really life-defining. And that's why we have so many people needing to essentially relive these experiences to reshape how they think of themselves in the world.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there. I mean, just to finish off today, because I've absolutely loved our conversation. If someone has maybe considered, actually, or maybe I do have ADHD, or they've seen some bits, or maybe just heard from this podcast, what's someone's first step? Because it's not as easy, like you say, there's years of waiting lists. It's not as easy if, I'm just going to go and find out. What would you say should be someone's first step if they feel that actually they are neurodiverse?
Mm-hmm. The path will depend on the resources that the person has. So probably the fastest resource, or path, but most expensive would be to seek private diagnosis. Now, the advantage of that is that waiting lists are going to be much shorter. The potential downsides are later on with treatment, there might be complications because if you choose the private pathway, then you have to buy medications if you choose to go down the medical route privately as well. And in order to transition that to the NHS, your GP practice needs to agree to shared care agreement. And anecdotally speaking, I'm hearing that not every GP practice is open to do that. They sometimes only accept NHS-led diagnoses. So there's a pro and con about going private. The speed of delivery of the diagnosis is the main advantage of that route. If someone wants to kind of go the NHS route, so to say, the best place to start is to speak to the GP, share the concerns, the observed symptoms. The GP then would direct the person either on a waiting list or to be a little bit more proactive, right to choose as a scheme can be very helpful here. So essentially that's the scheme I mentioned, that if there are some private clinics that conduct diagnoses through the kind of NHS way, so to say, waiting times are going to be lower, but the person wouldn't have to pay from their own pocket for the diagnosis.
Thank you so much for your time today and your insights into this. I've certainly, really enjoyed the conversation. I know you're doing some fantastic work. Wishing you all the best in your PhD and your research and that. And once again, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you so much. And may I ask a question for you, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Do you think you have ADHD? You mentioned some things, it seems like you have related to some of the things I shared. I'm wondering, what are you thinking?
Yes, is probably the shortest answer on that. I've certainly done a lot of research myself. I've worked with my therapist, who again has done some, she can't diagnose, but has ran several tests, and her advice is actually my next step should probably be to seek out a formal diagnosis. So I'm in that stage at the moment. This is the first time I'm sort of talking publicly about it, but
sorry for the question.
Yeah, no, it's fine, because it's, again, it's that acceptance and understanding of why I've done certain things for the majority of my life, and why I've struggled and become frustrated over certain things within my business and within my personal life, that actually it all relates back to this, and it's starting to make a little bit more sense. So certainly for me, I think my next step is to probably sort of get officially diagnosed and then go from there, and maybe what I'm fairly confident I do, and my close sort of friends and family are fairly confident as well, having had those conversations. Actually, I think it will just, like you said, give me permission to accept that, and then allow me to be more of myself.
100%. And that would kind of explain your entrepreneurial path as well, maybe, potentially.
Yeah. And certainly the way I've got numerous different business interests and things, because I need lots of different things to be working on, ready for when one's a little bit duller, I can jump onto the next one and get excited.
Well, thank you for allowing me to ask that question. I was curious as we were chatting, you kind of mentioned some things that seemed like you related to the stories.
I certainly do. Thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Balanced Ambition podcast. I genuinely hope the stories inspire you as much as they inspire me. If you found value in today's conversation, please share it with a friend. And remember, by subscribing, you won't miss an episode, and it would truly mean the world to me. Stay balanced, and I'll see you next time.